Castlevania III Dracula's Curse isn't the first Castlevania game, but it is the first to be conspicuously aware of the brand. 1, 2, and Game Boy's The Adventure were conventional monster stories with conventional monster story villains that needed to be slain by what was the conventional monster story heroes of the time, rugged, whip-wielding 80s action protagonists. They were timeless adventures that made sense regardless of what name showed up on the top of the box. Dracula's Curse uses a lot of those same inspirations, but molds them in a way that's more identifiably Castlevania. Booting up Castlevania III gives you a 2-minute cinematic intro outlining both the stakes of this individual game and some lore that contextualizes the previous adventures. It leans into Belmont being a family name. Simon wasn't just a Chad with a whip, he was part of a vampire-slaying lineage that beats Dracula back every time he pops up. The manual gives even more of this. Its pages are dense with locations, people, and poltergeists. Even the justification for our character's bloodline gets capitalized. Belmont Warlord chromosomes are the goofy, midichlorian-like explanation for why our heroes are so heroic. The franchise really started here. It's why Trevor and the Castlevania III team are the focus of the Netflix show instead of Simon. This is where we get enough proper nouns to make a legally distinct Castlevania story instead of just a Dracula one. There's a more is more philosophy that can be seen in these editions and in the way that they carry over to the combat and level design. Dracula's Curse was made for enthusiasts who already beat Castlevania 1, and while it whets that appetite pretty damn well, it comes at the cost of some of the intuitiveness and simplicity that made that first entry so classic. I liken it to 1 instead of 2 because this end to the NES trilogy is a return to the original style, for better and worse. Towns and townsfolk are gone, the experimental Metroidvania features of the second game are removed completely in favor of the arcade tradition, discrete levels, and temporary power-ups. The Simon's Quest gets away with some of its unflattery thanks to how unique it is. It invites contrasts to 1 instead of comparisons to it. Dracula's Curse is great, but it's not quite the encased in glass level great that I think the first game achieves. It's also the hardest of the 3 by a mile. Simon's ancestor, Trevor, controls identically. Same walk, same whip, same rigid relationship with jumping and stairs. But the levels and enemies that those controls must overcome have gotten way more intense. By the time the first level of Castlevania III is beaten, you'll have fought your way through almost the entire enemy gallery of Castlevania 1, and it only escalates from there. The weak spots in Trevor's toolkit are the dead zones his whip can't easily swing at, above him and diagonally in front of him. These areas are also where so many of the new aerially focused enemies like to make their home. The owls of level 2 swoop and re-swoop in a path just above your head, and these gargoyles may fly like Medusa heads, but they've got a much bigger hitbox and a much narrower hurtbox thanks to that shield. Precision is required in dealing with most of the new enemy types, and vertical level design demands you weave jumps in between those precise strikes. The original Castlevania had sequences that were vertical too, but not to this extent. The different floors there were usually just alternate paths in an otherwise horizontal journey, whereas Castlevania III has you moving left to right aiming for an exit at the top or bottom of the screen. This increase in ascending and descending levels pushes the NES-Vania control scheme to its limits, and the only way to overcome is to twist some of those limits in your favor. The magnetizing property of the stairs is a strict downside in a novice's hands, but use that same magnetizing behavior to protect yourself from enemy knockback, and you can effectively exchange health for reliable passage upwards. That's if the path upwards demands stairs, though. One of the defining aspects of Dracula's Curse is a heavy use of stage gimmicks. On one level, the bottom of the stage juts upwards and forces you to climb under a strict time limit. The path to Dracula's castle requires you memorize falling block patterns and sequence over a dozen of them to get to the apex of the screen. There's pendulums, seesaws, collapsing floors, and more. This has two effects. It makes each level of the game more unique and memorable, but it also makes the challenge of each level more isolated. Skills in this game are less transferable from level to level. With some exception, Castlevania 1 was about mastering Simon, whereas Castlevania 3 is more about mastering individual stage hazards. It has that in common with The Adventure. It makes the difficulty balance feel less gradual and more lopsided. It's a game of difficulty peaks and valleys rather than a difficulty curve. The upside to all this extra challenge is additional ways to respond to those challenges. Of all the proper noun dumping that happens in the manual, the most significant of them are new playable characters, each a solution to a problem found in Trevor's moveset. That weakness your whip has dealing with diagonal threats can be addressed in either Sypha's sword swing or Alucard's spread shot projectile. Trevor's usual reliance on hearts and sub-weapons to deal with ranged opponents make the roguish Grant Dynasty an opportune partner with his unlimited throwing knives. Sypha is the most similar to a Belmont. Despite her mage theming, she's the only one as heavily reliant on sub-weapons as Trevor, even more so thanks to how short range her sword swing is. It exacerbates the awkwardness that comes with how sub-weapons are distributed via candles and drops, and how you can accidentally screw over your entire run by picking up the wrong sub-weapon at the wrong time, which is something that has changed in future entries. The wide cast gives you options that extend beyond combat and into how they traverse levels as well. You'll quickly learn which characters can attack while on staircases, and which characters have mid-air jump controls, but there's more explicit spells and abilities that govern their locomotion too. Alucard, son of Dracula, can turn into a bat and fly past entire level sequences. Grant can cling to walls and ceilings, and the irony of Sypha is that she can be the most or least mobile character in the game, depending on whether or not you can execute some crazy speedrunner tech, with her ice spell turning enemies into impromptu platforms that can cheese you past certain level geometry. What helps prevent all this extra choice from feeling bloated is how the game structures itself around these new playable characters. There's way more levels here, but they've been smartly added to the girth of Castlevania III rather than the length. Forked paths leading to entirely optional levels give the game extra replayability and also act as homes to each of these side characters. Kill the boss of that side level, hear the little backstory of why your new friend wants to take down Dracula, then shake on it to add them to your party of 2, letting you swap between them freely at any point for the rest of your adventure. They're a great way of giving you way more ways to approach the challenges of Dracula's Curse, without giving Trevor more ways to approach the challenges of Dracula's Curse, retaining that NES-vania feel and form without just making you overpowered. If you want to see that more is more theme that Castlevania III has going for it on full display, there's no better example than the fight against Dracula himself. Each preceding Castlevania game has an ultimate battle that signals the style and strengths of its respective game, and 3's attempt to one-up its predecessor's content is made clear by having a 3-phase Dracula fight instead of the usual 2-phased encounter. Phase 1 is similar to the first Dracula fight. It's all about retaining the right distance from Dracula to bait his attacks in a way to let you respond with a whip to the head. The floating monstrosity he becomes in Phase 2 has a drippy blood attack you have to avoid, but the multiple faces on this monstrosity also mean multiple hitboxes, allowing you to duplicate your damage with the right angles or the right sub-weapons. The third phase offers the most drastic shift in style. Platforms rise from the ground to allow you to hit the gargoyle's head. It's the most platformy of the Dracula fights, not too dissimilar to the fight from Castlevania The Adventure. Defeating all 3 phases brings you to credits, with a slightly altered ending depending on which side character, if any, you recruited on your way to the castle. It wraps a game that's fun, if occasionally too frustrating for its own good, but one that's well worth playing. Which version you should be playing is a question that needs to be on the table though. It's almost impossible to discuss classic Vanias without getting into geographic differences, and Castlevania III is proudly unique depending on whether or not you're playing the NES or Famicom version. The Anniversary Collection that I'm playing it through has both, and the majority of the footage you're seeing on screen is the Japanese edition for a few different reasons. Some of those reasons are strictly technical. The introductory cinematic is moodier and darker thanks to some extra animations, and across the board, the music in the Japanese version has much more depth thanks to a richer Famicom sound system. But it's the bizarre way that this versioning impacts game balance that makes Japan the de facto choice. The damage the NES enemies deal to you is contingent upon which level you're in, whereas the Famicom version uses a more complex damage scaling calculation that differentiates between contact damage and weapon damage. That extra complexity usually maths out in your favor. Without getting into the weeds, you're probably taking more damage in America than you are in Japan. Grant Dynasty is the biggest loser though. That previously described ranged attack that defines his combat is actually a Japan-exclusive behavior. In the NES version, he just gets a gimped, low-range stab attack that isn't anywhere near as fun to use. Whether you're playing Castlevania III or its Famicom equivalent, Akumajo Densetsu, you're engaging with a worthwhile entry in the franchise. In both the core game and supplementary texts, this end to the NES trilogy shapes much of what this IP would become, but not without some compromises to the timelessness that made Castlevania 1 so great. There's an invisible perfection to that first game's difficulty that 3 does not emulate, despite using similar assets and identical controls. I still enjoyed my time, but find myself questioning how much I'll be revisiting. It's a good game, but playing it can be a pain in the neck.